Imagine conquering half of Europe and sending the bill to everyone else. Napoleon didn't just win battles, he built a financial machine where every defeated empire paid for the next campaign, turning indemnities, forced loans, and occupation costs into a river of cash that funded a 600,000-man army, while a newly stabilized currency and the Bank of France kept his war engine humming. Yet, as he tried to strangle Britain with the continental system and push his empire ever outward, the very model that depended on endless victories and fresh conquests began to crack. While across the Channel, Britain quietly weaponized its bond market, drove public debt above 200% of GDP, and still kept investor confidence, proving that in the end, capital markets could outlast even the greatest army, and that Napoleon's true defeat was less about Waterloo and more about a fragile financial architecture that collapsed the moment Europe stopped paying his bills. To understand how Napoleon could even attempt this kind of empire on credit, you have to start with chaos. In the 1790s, revolutionary France was broke, isolated, and under attack. The old royal tax system had collapsed, the monarchy's debts remained, and the new regime was fighting wars on multiple fronts. Their solution was paper money, the assignats. Backed on paper by confiscated church lands, assignats were meant to be a revolutionary fix for an ancient problem: how to turn land into liquid cash fast. But the temptation to print was too strong. By 1795, over 45 billion livres in assignats were in circulation. Inflation exploded, prices soared, and confidence in the currency evaporated. Ordinary French citizens watched their savings dissolve. By the time Napoleon arrived on the political stage, France didn't just need a strongman, it needed a monetary reboot. Napoleon understood that you can't build an empire on a currency nobody trusts. One of his first acts as first consul was not on a battlefield, but in finance. In 1800, he created the Bank of France, a central institution, partially private, designed to stabilize the monetary system and restore faith in French credit. Then, in 1803, he introduced the franc germinal, a new currency tied to a fixed weight of silver and gold. After a decade of paper chaos, this hard anchor was revolutionary in a different way. It meant soldiers could be paid in money that held its value, contractors and merchants could plan, and lenders could extend credit without fearing overnight collapse. In just a few years, France went from hyperinflationary turmoil to one of the most stable currencies in Europe. That stability would be the foundation for Napoleon's far more aggressive experiment, using war itself as a revenue model. Because even with a stable currency, empires are expensive. At its peak, Napoleon's Grande Armée mobilized close to 600,000 men. Feeding, arming, transporting, and paying a force that large required staggering sums, on the order of 600 to 700 million francs a year. France alone couldn't shoulder that burden for long, at least not through normal taxation. So Napoleon flipped the traditional logic of war finance. Instead of taxing his own citizens heavily to pay for campaigns, he made a strategic decision. Victory would pay the bills. Defeated states were not just enemies, they were future revenue streams. After crushing Austria at Austerlitz in 1805, the Treaty of Pressburg imposed roughly 40 million francs in indemnities. In 1807, after the twin defeats of Jena and Friedland, Prussia faced a far harsher fate, around 120 million francs in contributions, plus the costs of French occupation. And indemnities were only the headline number. French armies practiced what they called living on the land. Conquered and occupied territories had to feed, clothe, and house the troops stationed there. Local administrations were reorganized to prioritize French needs, with tribute payments, requisitions, and forced loans layered on top. Art, bullion, and raw materials flowed from conquered cities back to Paris. Newly created satellite states, from the Confederation of the Rhine to the Kingdom of Italy, were less independent nations than financial instruments, designed to provide soldiers and money on French terms. Each victory extended the frontier of extraction farther east and north. As long as the French armies kept winning, the system looked brilliant. War paid for war. The empire was a machine that monetized conquest. But there was a silent assumption underneath this model, that there would always be another victory, another territory to squeeze. That assumption shaped Napoleon's economic warfare against his most stubborn enemy, Britain. Unable to invade across the Channel, he tried to do something arguably more radical: remove Britain from the European economy entirely. In 1806, he launched the Continental System, a vast embargo that ordered European ports to close to British goods. The theory was simple. Britain was a commercial power, dependent on exports and trade finance. Cut it off its access to the continent, and its tax revenues and credit system would wither. In practice, the blockade strangled European trade networks, disrupted neutral shipping, and hurt French satellites and allies as much as Britain itself. Smuggling exploded. Merchants bribed officials, rerouted cargoes, or simply ignored decrees. Britain, backed by the Royal Navy, diverted trade to other markets, leaned harder into its financial sector, and actually adapted faster than the continental economies that were supposed to be its victims. While Napoleon was trying to make conquest self-funding, Britain was perfecting the opposite model: war on credit. The British state taxed heavily, especially through customs and excise, but its real superweapon was the bond market. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, London sold enormous quantities of government debt to investors at home and abroad. By 1815, British public debt had climbed beyond 200% of GDP, more than double the size of the economy. Yet investors kept buying. Why? Because Britain had something Napoleon's empire never fully achieved: a long track record of honoring its debts, a parliament that could credibly vote taxes, and a central bank, the Bank of England, that underwrote the system. British finances were strained, but fundamentally trusted. That trust allowed Britain to pour subsidies into its continental allies, keep its fleets at sea, and wait for Napoleon's model of conquest finance to exhaust itself. The breaking point came with the Russian campaign of 1212. Napoleon marched east, expecting another decisive victory, and with it another defeated empire to plunder. Instead, he encountered scorched earth, brutal weather, and an enemy that refused to play his game. The campaign destroyed the Grande Armée without producing a new source of indemnities or tribute. Suddenly, the machine that converted victories into cash had gone in reverse. As European powers sensed weakness, former satellites and occupied territories slipped away. With every defection, the flow of money, supplies, and manpower to France shrank. The fiscal logic that had once allowed Napoleon to fight on multiple fronts began to implode. Wars no longer paid themselves. They simply drained what was left of France's resources. After the final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the financial tables turned completely. The new treaties imposed on France looked very much like Napoleon's own terms, just aimed back at Paris. The restored Bourbon monarchy was forced to accept 700 million francs in reparations, plus the costs of foreign occupation on French soil. At the same time, the wars had accelerated a deeper transformation, a shift from conquest-based finance to institutional credit as the foundation of great power status. European states, watching Britain's survival and eventual triumph, drew the lesson that a resilient tax system, credible debt, and functioning capital markets could be more decisive than any single general. Napoleon's rise and fall, seen through this financial lens, looks less like a morality play about individual ambition and more like a stress test of two different economic models. One relied on victory, tribute, and the ability to push the bill onto foreigners. The other relied on trust, taxation and the willingness of investors to keep lending through crisis after crisis. In the short term, Napoleon's model was sensationally effective. It allowed France to field gigantic armies, redraw the map of Europe, and terrify every royal court from Madrid to Moscow. But it was inherently brittle because it depended on constant expansion. Britain's system looked slower and more painful, debt piling up, taxes rising, but it was sustainable because it could survive defeats and keep paying.